Dwarkesh Patel is a recent college graduate and the host of his podcast and Substack called The Lunar Society. In his podcast, he interviews scientists, historians, economists, and intellectuals across disciplines. Some of his guests include Marc Andreessen, Nat Friedman, Tyler Cowen, and Will MacAskill. In his interviews and his writing, Dwarkesh explores and discusses some of the most relevant ideas to modern society, including the heritability of intelligence, the trade-offs between different immigration policies, and the first and second order impacts of AI. Thanks for taking the time to talk today, Dwarkesh.
That was a great intro, man. I got to steal it. Because often people will be like, what are you up to? And I'm like, I'm a podcast. What's your podcast about? Well, that's an interesting question.
First question, do human intellectual liquidity providers become more or less valuable in a world of ubiquitous AI? If GPT-X can effectively create on-demand narratives and learning cater to each individual's preferences, how will human intellectual liquidity providers distinguish themselves?
That's a really good question, actually. I mean, one way to think about it is that GPT is really good at getting you the answer to things you know you want to look for. That might make the job of somebody who connects ideas that you didn't even know about much easier. And so in some sense, it's a complement to their discipline. If you can, look up how something in physics works, you don't know how to connect that to some history of the Manhattan Project because you just don't know what to look for. Maybe there's a special place for the kind of person who can put all that together, and maybe it makes their job easier as well.
But wouldn't those humans intellectual providers be simply a first order path? So say you want to learn about like optimizing health, what's to stop someone from saying, write me a plan in the voice of Andrew Huberman or some other health-like individual? Do those people simply become a discovery function and the AI actually becomes like the second order, deep, insightful interactions?
I've been surprised to the extent at which I'm not using the GPTs to learn things. I really can't remember the last time I actually used it to, explain this to me. Maybe just that my function or the way I learn, I just haven't updated yet, and I should be using more GPT. But yeah, we'll see what happens there. I mean, at some point when they get to be human level intelligence, at that point, obviously they're going to be better at explaining things. But yeah, that's an interesting question. If they get to the point where they can't just summarize what Huberman would say about that supplement you're considering, obviously they would be preferable. What do you think?
My first order thought is that there maybe is something innate to wanting to get nerd sniped or learn something from a different human. And that's kind of how like these communities developed and how these tribes developed over time. But I think the on-demand nature of AI and the customizing to your learning preferences at any point in time is going to actually be a lot better than anything that some generalist podcaster might have to say about like a variety of topics versus just the one pointed specific recommendation. Yeah.
That does make sense to me. I'd be very curious to see how the use of that evolves. What do you use it for, though? Because really the only thing I use it for is as a thesaurus. I'll be like writing something and I'll say the synonyms for X. Do you use it for your either your studies or your podcast prep or anything like that?
Don't use it for podcast prep. It kind of just came out towards the end of my college career, so I didn't really have anything too meaningful to use it for. I think it's really good at coding certain things, especially in libraries that I was trained on, like React or Python. I think it's also really good for aggregating information and stuff like that. So yesterday I looked up who had the highest assist to turnover ratio in the NBA and list all the top three. I think it's really good at aggregating certain ratios or certain things that are pieced together, but nothing super novel yet on my end.
Yeah, actually, come to think of it, the last time I did use it was I needed to write some script to basically do some regex on the transcripts of my podcast. And I was like, I could spend half an hour looking up the regex libraries and things like that. And I just put into ChatGPT, do this thing, write a regex, Python program that does this thing. So that in that is really useful.
In your most recent essay on Robert Caro's Lyndon Johnson biographies, you identified the Straussian reading of these books to be sort of a guidebook for the next Lyndon Johnson. Has society effectively internalized and rejected this message, at the very least in the public sector, by adding layers of bureaucracy? The autobiographies and biographies of recent presidents and other powerful officials do not appear to project the same message, either explicitly or implicitly.
The message being that you have to be Machiavellian to get power? Is that what you're saying?
That, and it's actually achievable in the public sector today.
That seems right to me, especially when modern biographies are written about modern figures. They're so present that Usually they don't get into the Machiavellian ways in which they got where they are. I don't know. I haven't read these books, but I imagine some biography of Obama is not going to include all the power politics, right? It will be a more idealistic message. And it could just be that, there was a time in politics when LBJ was coming up where it was a much more entrepreneurial setting, if that makes sense. Like the organizations he led, early in his career, he was the head of a New Deal agency. He was the youngest state head of such an agency. And sorry, he wasn't the head of a New Deal agency. He was the head of the state branch of an agency. And he ran it like a startup. And it's hard to imagine, are there government bureaucracies today which have that kind of freshness as LBJ's programs had at the time FDR's programs had when they were created, where some guy can just run it as a startup? And in that environment, you can probably have much more of this sort of power seeking aspect. And come to think of it, in the context of Silicon Valley, there's been a lot of books written about, Bad Blood, or that book about Theranos, or the book about WeWork, where they actually do represent a lot of the ways in which these entrepreneurs are able to get funding and employees by twisting the truth, by going beyond the normal means of persuasion. So, yeah, I think the environment that looks like government did back then, which is Silicon Valley, actually does have that sort of accurate representation of what it takes.
Are startups in tech, kind of what you alluded to, are they where the Lyndon Johnsons of today are going to? I guess one reading of Talent by Tyler Cowen and Daniel Gross is similar, where perhaps what they're really saying is that truly talented individuals are extremely scarce, and that book is sort of like a startup guide or a starting guide for attracting, navigating, and forming kind of talented, like-minded individuals. So are startups in tech where people are shunted to with that sort of work ethic and outlook?
Yeah, although I wouldn't say shunted, and they can choose wherever they want to go. And I'm not sure what exactly the function looks like of how they determine where to go. But it clearly seems to be the case that, is that even accurate? Because one thing I've heard a lot is that the staffers in DC are actually very smart, while the politicians themselves, you look at them on TV and they're pretty stupid. The world I'm most in contact with is the tech world, and there it does seem like basically every smart person I know has migrated to doing something here. But then the question is like, well, society's not forcing them to go there, right? There must be certain things that make them more inclined to be here rather than somewhere else. And it could just be that you can make more progress here. It's more prestige. There's more money. Also, what else are you going to do in today's world? Like, if you're not going to go into tech, you're going to wait until you're 60 years old before you can run for your congressional seat, before your current congressman dies. So, yeah, I guess they're choosing for a bunch of reasons to go into tech.
It seems that being a staffer on the East Coast or in Washington is very much an East Coast centric thing, where it probably doesn't attract as much talent as startups and tech globally, but it sort of is this like insular community of prestige, of sort of credentialism. You have to go to the right school to be accepted to be a staff intern at the White House. Are there any ways that we should be looking to increase the prestige of those kind of jobs, or because pay is largely not power law, there's not like a huge incentive in equity? Mm-hmm. Are there any ways that we can sort of increase the prestige and increase the global talent pool for these type of jobs?
I've heard in Singapore and Taiwan, it's actually pretty prestigious to work in government. And as a result, they get really high quality people to work in government. As for how you do that, well, prestige is cultural. So the solution has to involve changing the culture. How that happens is not clear to me. Presumably, if you had more idols of the kind that, because of this very smart staffer, some important new rule was passed, some important change was made, and those are publicized, I guess I could see that having an effect. Other than that, I'm not sure. Maybe if there was a more clear and fast way to get from being an energetic young person to actually being in an important and influential role in government, where you're not waiting for years or decades. Other than that, I'm not sure I have any other ideas.
Does society need more Robert Caro in the sense of authors and intellectual liquidity providers? If so, how can society raise the incentives and overall status to increase the number of Robert Caros?
The status of Robert Caro is pretty high. I mean, he got a Presidential Medal of the Humanities. I forgot what it's called exactly, but he's very famous as far as authors go. How can society incentivize that even more? Well, one of the things I talked about in the essay is that the kind of person who could do what Robert Caro did, who has that sort of intensity and attention, where you spend 50 years writing the biography of a single person, that kind of person probably has better things to do, right? That kind of person just probably wants to directly get involved in the mix. So do we need to incentivize the kind of people who directly want to get into the mix, take a step back and provide analyses and documentation on how the process works? Yeah, plausibly. Although on the other hand, aren't there enough people writing books? Like, doesn't the average book get read by 100 people? So presumably all the people who could be Robert Caros, like how many of people are there who could write a book like that who are just doing something else instead? Yeah, I'm not sure on that one, actually.
Do we sort of, in essence, have a lot of small-time Robert Caros today, albeit not with the stamina or long-term focus, publishing on super niche topics on platforms like Substack and Twitter? Is this like the better equilibrium for writers today?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of my favorite authors is Bern Hobart, and he's a friend too. But for people who are not familiar, he's a finance writer, but that is not an accurate way to represent the range of his writing. You know, there's stuff in there that's connecting the market values discourses to how big tech firms work. There's stuff in there that's applying option theory to how you think about your career choices. So anyways, that kind of thing where you're, you know, really somebody who's really, really smart and really, really capable is analyzing different aspects of problems. I think we're probably living in a golden age of that. Where if you, for example, you know, people like Scott Alexander and Byrne, and there's so many other people like that, obviously. I can't think of another era in history where the intellectual climate, where ordinary people like you and me get to participate in and engage with these people, is so fruitful. I think we probably will look back on this as a golden age.
In an ideal equilibrium, are they necessarily full-time jobs, or do you think that it being a part-time job is actually a feature where they can pull from their daily experiences and other things like that?
That's a good question. Patrick McKinsey, for example, who also writes about similar topics, he works at Stripe, and I'm sure that informs his view on his ability to write about financial topics. When Scott Alexander was, some would argue, in his golden age, he was just a psychiatrist, and he was doing this on the side. There's so many other examples you could go through, you know, some startup founder or computer scientist. I just discovered the other day, there's this guy, I'm forgetting his name, but he's written some of the most interesting blog posts about analyzing the differences between human brains and how they evolved to how the different AI models are evolving. And he's just running a startup. That's his main thing. That's actually very successful, probably hundreds of millions in revenue. So yeah, it seems plausible that the real world experience could reinforce the actual things we're writing about. And that's probably productive.
You've written a bit about how effective altruism exists as a Schelling point amongst billionaires, and I would urge anyone who hasn't read it to read it. Amongst economists and others in general, is libertarianism also a Schelling point, especially early in one's career? I think you've also described yourself as someone, at least with libertarian tendencies.
And why would it be a Schelling point?
Perhaps it signals that you don't play by standard left-right politics. You're perhaps an independent thinker. Perhaps you think government interventions are bad because they do not invite as much competition or things along those lines.
Yeah. Libertarian thinkers argue for libertarianism being a Schelling point in general because, according to them, there's a slippery slope between having some regulation of an area and then just taking it too far. For example, Brian Kaplan in his book on housing, I guess it's not published yet, but I hope he doesn't mind me spoiling this part. He talks about how his solution, so the problem with housing is we don't have enough supply because we're not allowing enough to be produced. And he argues the only solution here is that the ideal solution is we say, if you build it on your land, it's your land. You can do whatever the fuck you want on it. Because anything else other than that, if you have any sort of zoning, whatever, it's just going to escalate. So I can see that being a Schelling point for society in general, that we're going to have libertarian principles because there's always this slippery slope if we abandon those. As for libertarian economists in particular, I could see a similar sort of reasoning there, where it's you start talking too much about the market failures, and you may come under the impression that those are more common than they actually are, and maybe just sticking to the good old libertarian principles is the best way to understand the world.
Would you describe yourself as an effective altruist, an EA moderate, or something completely different?
Yeah, I'll buy the label in the sense that I do think there's something valuable about the idea of you think about where you could add the most value in the world, and you think about that rigorously and quantitatively, not based on vibes. And then you engage seriously, and that implies for what you should do. I'll tag on to that. There's a different question of, do you buy all the beliefs that are common within the community? But just a sort of basic way of approaching the world doesn't seem majorly wrong to me.
You've now interviewed a decent number of intelligent people, likely in the upper echelon, in a wide array of fields from economics to AI to space. Do you think that older or retired guests are, on average, more candid? Have your best interviews been of people in the midst of their careers or people looking back on their careers?
That's a great question. The most recent interview that was published was with Richard Rhodes, who is 87, and he was the author of The Making of the Atomic Bomb. I guess he still is the author. And that was a great interview. He was able to tell some stories that I don't know how comfortable he would have been telling them when the subjects of his books, the physicists he interviewed from the Los Alamos, would have still been alive. So yeah, I guess it's plausible that while they're in the midst of their career, they don't want to be too provocative. I'm trying to think, are there other people I've interviewed who are retired? I interviewed SBF while he was still running FTX. So it would be interesting to interview him while he's retired. I think that would be a more interesting interview. Actually, come to think of it, so I also interviewed Augustin LeBron, who's a former Jane Street trader, and he's doing a new thing now, but being able to talk about a previous part of his life. I think people maybe have had time to assimilate their lessons and think carefully and are more willing to divulge things. So yeah, I guess that is a pattern I didn't notice.
How Straussian do you think the guests are on your podcast? And do you think this variation is largely explained by their career circumstances and incentive structures or general worldview?
I think they're very Straussian. I'm not sure if I'm using the word in the technical correct sense, but I do definitely think that they're very coy about certain implications of their ideas. And I always admire when they will just come out and say it, what they mean. Garrett Jones was a recent interviewee, and he has a book about why national IQ matters. He has a book about why immigrants from certain countries are, not necessarily as productive as immigrants from other countries. And I don't know, other guests probably have similar ideas, or maybe the implications from their ideas come to these sorts of spheres. And I always like it when they will just directly say what they mean, or at least, probe at it instead of just evading it completely.
Why do you think Garrett Jones is comfortable or maybe has enough social capital to say these things? It appears that like a lot of your other guests are also of similar high stature, and they can get away with not being canceled by saying something. What's their reasoning, or what's your take on their reasoning? Why can't they be more direct?
I think their reasoning is I have so many different ideas and projects that I'm trying to push through in my career. And if you have some hot button issue, is it my comparative advantage to be able to push this thing forward, where so many people in the culture are talking about this? Like, why would I torch my career when I have so many things that only I can research? Shouldn't I be focusing on those? And I think that's very legitimate, right? If I was in their position, I'd be doing the same thing. In the case of Garrett Jones, I think the main brunt of his ideas are the heart of his ideas is controversial, right? It's not some peripheral thing. So he's more comfortable just embracing it. But it's an interesting dilemma, because if everybody who had these ideas had like better things to do than put them out there, you have this sort of prisoner's dilemma thing where then nobody's the person who's standing in the center of the arena saying, here, I'll defend this. But yeah, I can see from each individual's point of view that it's rational that they don't torch their other work for something that they don't really even care about that much.
You've interviewed quite a few GMU Mafia individuals now, including Tyler Cowen, Alex Tabarrok, Brian Kaplan.
So have you.
Just a Tyler Cowen so far.
Okay.
What's the rate limiting factor as to what is preventing the creation of more Mercatus-centered institutions? What should the marginal economics or research institution do in order to increase productivity and output?
Yeah. By the way, to be clear, I'm not an economist. I did computer science, so this is definitely not my training. I can relay a story that Brian Kaplan told me, which I thought was really interesting. He's teaching econ grad students, and they come in and they do really well in their classes, the advanced microeconomics class or whatever. And then junior and senior, or whatever the equivalent is in graduate school, the final years of the program start coming up, and they have to come up with a thesis. And they come to Brian and they say, so what should our thesis be? And Brian says, no, that's your job. You figure out what your thesis is. It's like, okay, well, what should I figure out my thesis is? I do think that there's something tremendously creative about people like Brian and Tyler and Robin, just where you have all these tools for thinking about economics and you apply them to an area that nobody has thought to apply them. As much as people have integrated the lesson from the Case Against Education, it is such a brilliant book for the audience that just is trying to prove that education is mostly signaling. And just going through all the arguments you can have against that. And he's like a chess master. You have every move you can think of to do against him. He's countered it. Presumably this sort of, it's not complex economics, right? Like I can read it and understand it, but just being able to apply those same mental models to this field and integrate all the data there, talk to all the read all the literature, talk to all the people there, and then apply this economic lens there. I think that's probably pretty rare.
On your podcast, it looks like you were able to visit them and interview many of them in person. Subjectively, was the environment or themselves palpably different than your university at UT Austin? What was the environment? Was the way that they interacted with you any different at UT Austin?
As in the relationships I have with my professors in my own university?
Yeah, or like any general sense that you got off of them, first impression, second impression.
Yeah, I mean, I was never as friendly to my professors as I've gotten a chance to be with some of the people at GMU. And it's been really great. I mean, especially since my professors are mostly, computer science professors, and they're much less interested in talking about big picture ideas as the GMU people. So the main difference is probably just the range of topics they're interested in talking about.
I think it was Peter Thiel that referenced the ask quality as a common trait amongst some founders in order to be able to be comfortable doing contrarian or unpopular things. Granted, not all of your guests are necessarily contrarian, but have you noticed any non-obvious or unexpected common characteristics between your guests?
Not all my guests are necessarily contrarian, but all are aspy. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Common traits. I think I really can't think of a good counterexample. If you go to a random college, or even a good college, and you go to a random professor, usually they don't have a strong interest outside of their direct field and their direct sub field. Whereas I guess a guest I've had the opportunity to interview, they have not only a broad range of interest, which many people can have, but a broad range of expertise. There's so many different topics that they've studied really well, and they're able to answer questions on. I would say that there's a commonality.
Do you think that trait is sort of cultivated over time as some of them have become bloggers and have done more public facing stuff? Or do you think that's something that is a result of them being so elite at their given field?
I think more the latter. There's many sort of origin stories here where they were doing this stuff since they were like 18 or younger, just and not just amateur stuff, but like really like writing detailed and really insightful stuff from a very young age. Yeah, I think they were just born really voracious.
In what ways is being good at podcasting isomorphically similar to doing well in high school speech and debate? Is there any fundamental difference between being charismatic or convincing online versus in person?
Although in both cases you are online and in person. Well, maybe you're not online with speech and debate, but you are in person when you're doing a podcast as well as online. And certainly the charisma, I'm not saying I have special charisma or anything. I'm just saying a little bit of friendliness and personability helps you get along with the guest, and you can riff with them and things like that. One is just that the basics of presentation are something you have to learn no matter what you're doing, as long as it involves talking to other human beings, maybe many at a time. And this is something I've actually gotten a lot better at throughout doing the podcast. Presumably I knew this in high school and just forgot it when I started the podcast, but I really can't listen to any of my episodes more than a year ago. I'm just stuttering all over the place. And they're much less smooth. So I do think probably speech and debate helped you in that you were just put in this room. You have to extemporaneously craft arguments, put together ideas. I think it's a pretty valuable experience.
How do you approach trying to learn as much as possible about a given topic for an upcoming interview? Do you talk with as many other experts as possible, reading as many primary papers, use AI? Is it dependent on the field or industry?
Yeah, I do try to do as much as possible. And here's the ways in which it can depend. Sometimes it's just a matter of reading their books. When I interviewed Kenneth Jackson, who is the preeminent historian on New York, about the biography of Robert Moses, the power broker, obviously I read The Power Broker. I read his book, which was a response to The Power Broker. That was a hagiography of Robert Moses. I read a few other reviews and a few other articles about Robert Moses and this controversy, and then try to learn a little more about that. But mostly what I'm trying to say was that it was a textual, you just read like thousands of pages. As for some other interviews, when I interviewed Ilya Sutskever, it was much less about some things you can just read on the internet, because I really wanted to ask him about what's at the frontier, and what's at the frontier is not nothing that the companies are going to put on paper. So it was much more like I just learned, okay, like what is attention, the transformer mechanism, and just like code it up from scratch, right? And from there, then talk to a whole bunch of researchers. I talked to a whole bunch of researchers at Google Brain and OpenAI and Anthropic. Probably talked to half a dozen such people, and just got a better sense of like what is the frontier stuff they're working on, what are the problems they have to solve to get the next generation better. So you can see there's a spectrum of just like read a whole bunch of shit that you know you have to read to you have no idea what's new in this space and talk to all the people. And it kind of is a mix between that depending on the discipline. How about you? What about your interviews?
I think it's mostly been reading and listening to primary accounts of things they've talked to or wrote about. I haven't delved too deep into talking with directly adjacent experts too much. I think at least for my first two, I had some experience in crypto or in the industry, so
Yeah.
it was more natural. For Tyler Cowen, it was more sort of my economics undergrad experience plus just reading like Marginal Revolution for a while and reading most of his stuff. Sure.
Right. Yeah. No, definitely the context that led you to decide to interview them in the first place is very helpful.
You've had some discussions with podcast guests, including Steve Shu, about the heritability of intelligence and how society will likely have to grapple with this phenomenon, especially when it comes to genetically engineering progeny. To what extent is verbal intelligence and charisma heritable?
I'm guessing verbal intelligence is just as heritable. I'm not saying it has to be, but I have no reason to think it's less or more heritable than intelligence in general, which is like 0.5 to 0.8, the fraction of the variation. As for charisma, I've actually wondered a lot about charisma. Like, what exactly is it? Well, we know what it does, right? It makes you more likable, and we can see it when it occurs. We can tell that Brad Pitt is really charismatic. But why is that not something we can all do? If it's some ability that's super valuable in terms of, getting you mates and getting you things you want in the world, why is that so hard to fake? Because it clearly represents your like internal confidence and maybe even your honesty. It does seem like charisma is much more trainable than intelligence. So I would guess it's much less heritable. People go from just being very inconfident and a charisma black hole to actually being able to be funny on the spot, personable, and things like that.
To what extent is that part of charisma just an extension of becoming more sociable? If in the sense that you're able to make jokes in the spot or you're able to integrate yourself better in society, is that necessarily what charisma is or entails?
I guess it's a bit like asking, okay, you're just better at doing the SATs and you're better at, solving lead code problems. Is that what intelligence is? It's like, that's not necessarily what intelligence is, but that's what it allows you to do. I'm not sure what it is exactly, but it is really striking how much it just, from a few seconds of an interaction, you can tell how charismatic somebody is. Like you watch a movie with George Clooney or Brad Pitt. I keep mentioning Brad Pitt a lot. Just like a few seconds, you can tell that this person is charismatic, whereas that's much harder to do with intelligence. It's so many different things. It's body language, it's posture, it's confidence, it's how you speak. There's so many different things are included there.
Speaking of Brad Pitt, will lookism get worse as the authenticity premium goes up in a world of AI and people seeking direct human interaction?
It might go down, right? Because if you're using VR to interact with people, then you can just modify your looks. And eventually you just have like plastic surgery that is really good. Why would it get worse?
And one argument of why lookism might get worse is people will have a higher premium or put higher value on in-person interactions because that's the one thing that can't be faked today. So people will...
I see. Like nothing else about you is valuable. Yeah, I can just do everything else better than you. So the only thing that matters is how chill are you and how good looking are you in person.
Yeah.
That actually seems very plausible to me. Because if a human being is just like, everything else the AIs can do, or you just have to be a good hang, then it's all about being a good hang. And part of that is looks. I can see that happening. Hopefully that's not the case. I guess the question is what else also goes up in relative value, and whether plausibly we're just not interacting in person anyways. You just modify the Apple avatar that comes on your Vision Pro. So yeah.
If you're up for it, I would love to play a game of X or Y where I say two things and you choose between the two.
Yo, go for it.
One, a 10% increase in earnings per year for the next 5 years, or an 80% chance you earn $0 and a 20% chance you 5x current earnings.
My current earnings as of this moment are zero. So, but then again, 10% increase of zero is still zero. What is the expected value there? 20% times double. So 20 times two, basically. So 0.4. Yeah, 40% increase is the expected value there. See, the thing is, though, earnings is like a small part of my total utility function, and the stability that comes from having earnings that are, something I can manage my projects with a 10% increase. I would much rather have that because that's much more important to my total utility function than just maximizing expected earnings over the next few years.
IIT or MIT as a better signal for elite institutions or companies seeking the best technical talent?
I don't know that much about the IITs, but I would still say MIT, given how little I know. Maybe just like the surface level, it seems to me that a lot of really super talented founders and stuff come from MIT. This is almost certainly inaccurate, but I personally I can't off the top of my head remember any like really remarkable people, John Carmack level people who have come from IITs. This could be the fact that India is just starting to get rich, and so in 20 years it will be totally different. But as of right now, yeah, maybe something about the American system is just producing more talent.
I think Satya Nadella are people that IIT has produced a lot of people that have been really good at scaling it up, or like things that just take a deep amount of discipline and hard work. What about the American system do you think makes it more unique, or at least something that IIT is trying to emulate in a Western model?
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. That's a good point. And probably Sundar Pichai is also from IITs, right? And I said that John Carmack is an example, but I don't think he went to MIT. So that example is wrong too. I just meant that is an example of a sort of American type engineer. I expect if you go to MIT, you get a more full education. You get exposed to different networks of hackers and founders. That might be the case in India. I'm really not sure. Like I know nothing about the IIT. So I'm just this is only my opinion about MIT, which I guess I'm positive about.
Austin or Miami? Which city is more likely to have a larger tech scene in 10 years?
I've been to Miami. I don't know that much about their tech scene, but I'm gonna guess Austin. I think people are having a lot of fun in Miami, but I don't know how much tech is going on. I know personally people who have moved away from Miami because there wasn't that much going on, even though they moved there initially during COVID to get away from San Francisco. They moved back from Miami is what I meant to say. Yeah, so I'm guessing Austin.
University of Austin as in-person new take on institution, or Minerva as the online institution? Which model do you think better optimizes for outliers?
I actually met the president of the University of Austin once, but I just think it's like very cringe. And so I'm just like, whatever Minerva is, I don't know what it is, but I'm just going to guess it's going to be better.
What makes University of Austin cringe?
It's trying so hard to do like, we're Yale or we're Harvard, but we're not Vogue. And you're like, first of all, you're not as good as Harvard. And second, you're not like the entire premise would be we're only upstarts, but we have some actual better value, or we're doing something really interesting and new. I don't know. It's like you go to the store and you see some knockoff Walmart Coca-Cola and they say like, we don't use this artificial sweetener or use another artificial sweetener. It's like, fuck it. I'm just going to get normal Coke, right? You got to be like a truly different kind of drink for me to want to get you.
Do you think that they would have a better chance of success now if they didn't try to go after super credentialed guests or super credentialed professors to try to beat anti-woke Harvard?
Well, no, I think that actually it was important. For something that was successful in this way and was a Thiel Fellowship. And they didn't just go after like average students. They went after the cream of the crop. So I think getting the Steven Pinkers and so forth is actually a great idea. But do something unique with them. Don't just make them part of some anti-woke creed. And I think that was so cringe that even Steven Pinker backed out, right? He's like, yeah, I'll be an advisor, but I'm not involved with this anymore.
But with respect to the Thiel Fellowship, at least especially in the early years, they were working hard to try to back people that didn't have those same credentials in the early part of the career. They were like 18, 19. They were people that were in college, maybe have done like one small project. Is that something that's even feasible for professors, or how do you even search that signal amongst all the noise that exists today?
But you know what's hilarious is that they explicitly look for that signal. They were like,
now they do, yeah.
No. But to be in the Thiel Fellowship, you have to drop out from an Ivy League college. Like you have to get admitted to Stanford or Harvard or something. Only then can you apply for the Thiel Fellowship. So in some ironic sense, they're the ones most relying on those signals, right? Even within these elite colleges, it is still the case that I'm guessing probably the best researchers in the world are still at these elite colleges. And so it's probably a reasonable proxy, especially if you're getting like your first 5 hires or something. And from there, you can get the people who are most productive or interesting in that field.
In-person or virtual interviews, which format is more conducive towards more candid guests?
In person, I could see an interesting argument for virtual where because you're not like, doesn't feel like interrogating them. They just feel like they're in my house. I'm more comfortable and therefore they can just let loose, not realizing it's all being recorded. But I've done a few in-person interviews and those have felt way more intimate. And I don't know if any guest has revealed anything super personal in any interview, but it does feel like the in-person ones are better at this.
Final question. Lyndon B. Johnson or Adam Smith, who would you rather get the chance to talk to on or off your podcast?
Oh, I think on and off would be a different answer.
We can do each separately.
On, it's got to be Adam Smith because we have interviews with Lyndon Johnson. And besides any interesting questions I would ask him, he's, a good politician. He's not going to answer them. Whereas Adam Smith, like, what the fuck did he think about so many different things? Who knows, right? You could talk to him today. That'd be amazing. Even off, I would talk to him for the same exact reason. I would be very curious about his takes on a few things.
Dwarkesh, it was a pleasure. Thanks for taking the time to talk today.
Yeah, it was fun, man. Thanks for having me on.